It started with a knock I will never forget. Not the polite kind, not the gentle tap of a friendly neighbor stopping by to borrow a wrench. No. This knock was the heavy, bone-rattling thud of someone who had already decided they owned the right to be in your home, before you even opened the door. I remember glancing at my wife, Claire, 32 years old, dark hair pulled into a loose bun, wearing the soft blue cardigan I'd bought her last Christmas. She looked up from her coffee, puzzled. I could feel her eyes on me as I set my mug down and headed toward the front door. 3 men stood there. One of them, a thick-necked brute in an ill-fitting polo shirt with the HOA security logo stitched across the chest, leaned forward with an expression that made my stomach tighten. His name was Greg Maddox, 45, the self-appointed enforcer of the Cedar Pines Homeowners Association. Behind him stood 2 other board members, Marvin, a rail-thin accountant with permanent sweat stains under his arms, and Lisa, the HOA president whose smile never reached her eyes. "Mr. Carter," Greg said, his voice flat. "We need to speak to your wife." I frowned. "About what?" Lisa crossed her arms. "We've had multiple complaints about the unauthorized parking of your truck in the shared cul-de-sac. It's a violation of Section 12B of our community bylaws." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how absurd it sounded. I'm a retired Army staff sergeant. I've parked my truck in that same spot for years without a single complaint. "It's not unauthorized," I said, my voice low. "That spot's public access." Marvin's eyes darted to Greg, who stepped forward until his bulk nearly filled my doorway. "Sir, this isn't a discussion. We need your wife outside to verify she's the one who moved the cones yesterday." I turned my head toward Claire, who was now standing behind me, confused but calm. She didn't get a chance to ask what was going on before Greg stepped forward again, into our home. "Back off," I said, blocking him with my arm. And that's when it happened. In one swift motion, Greg shoved past me, and before I could react, his fist connected with Claire's jaw. The sound was sickening, a dull, wet crack. She staggered backward, hitting the side table, coffee spilling across the carpet. I froze. Not because I was afraid, but because for one sharp, blinding second, I couldn't believe what I had just seen. And then the soldier in me woke up. I grabbed Greg by the collar and yanked him backward with all the force in my body, my knuckles tightening until his feet barely touched the floor. Marvin shouted something, Lisa screamed, but my focus was locked on the man who had just punched my wife inside our own home. This wasn't a disagreement anymore. This wasn't about trucks, or cones, or HOA rules. This was war. Welcome to Fenceline Story, where the quiet lines between neighbors can become battlefields. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments where you're watching this from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. I stood there with Greg's shirt bunched in my fists, feeling every muscle in my body coil. Claire was holding her face, tears brimming in her eyes, though she was already trying to tell me she was fine. She wasn't fine. She was in shock. Greg's face twisted into something between arrogance and fear. "You're making a mistake," he hissed. "No," I thought. "You already made the mistake." When I let him go, it wasn't because I was done. It was because this wasn't going to end in my living room. This was going to be bigger. Much bigger. Later, after the police came and did nothing, after they filed it as a civil dispute, despite the clear bruise forming on Claire's cheek, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the neat, laminated HOA bylaws they'd shoved under our door months earlier. How had it come to this? How had a neighborhood meant to be safe and protected turned into a place where 3 board members thought they could barge into a veteran's home and assault his wife without consequence? The real question burned in my mind, heavy and poisonous. If the people in power can twist the rules to justify violence, what's to stop them from doing anything? I didn't know it then, but that was the moment I stopped being just another homeowner. I became their problem. And they had no idea what was coming for them. The day after Greg's attack on Claire, the neighborhood felt different. The streets looked the same, the tidy row of beige two-story houses, the manicured lawns cut at exactly 2 inches, HOA regulation, of course, the white mailboxes in perfect alignment, but underneath that postcard image, I could feel it, the quiet hum of something rotten. I'd lived in Cedar Pines for 5 years. Long enough to know the faces and names, but not so long that I'd gotten used to the politics. When we moved here, I thought the HOA was just some paperwork and yearly dues, a little committee that made sure nobody painted their house neon green or left a boat in the driveway. It didn't take long to see it was more than that. It was a kingdom. And people like Greg, Marvin, and Lisa? They weren't just board members, they were kings and queens, ruling over their little fiefdom with the bylaws as their crown. The parking issue that started all this? That wasn't really the problem. It was a trigger. The truth is, I'd been on their radar for months. It started last summer when I built a small shed in my backyard. Just a modest, 8x10 wood structure to store my tools. I submitted the request, waited for approval, and got a denial letter with no explanation. When I built it anyway, because the state code allowed it, they slapped me with fines. I appealed. They lost. I think that's when I became an enemy. The Cedar Pines HOA didn't like losing. They liked control. And I wasn't the kind of person who bent just because someone in a polo shirt told me to. Claire, on the other hand, kept telling me to pick my battles. They're just neighbors, she'd say, brushing it off. But the thing about power, even petty power, is that it's addictive. And when people like Lisa taste it, they don't just want to use it, they want to prove they can use it against anyone. I started paying closer attention to the board meetings. Not because I cared about which contractor was trimming the hedges or whether the community pool got a new filter, but because I wanted to see them in action. And the more I watched, the more I realized. These rules they loved quoting. They weren't about keeping the neighborhood nice. They were about keeping the board in charge. You could see it in the way Lisa ran the meetings. She sat at the center of the long folding table, Marvin on her left with his spreadsheet printouts, Greg on her right like some kind of bouncer in khakis. Whenever someone raised a complaint, about fees, or parking, or the fact that the HOA landscaping crew kept blowing leaves onto their driveway, Lisa would smile that tight smile and say, "We'll take that under consideration." But, consideration always meant no. I'd overheard one conversation at the coffee shop between Lisa and Greg. They didn't know I was behind them in line. She was saying something about setting an example so other homeowners wouldn't get any ideas. Ideas like questioning them. Ideas like standing up for themselves. After the punch, I started hearing stories I'd never heard before. My neighbor, Carlos, 38, single dad, told me they'd threatened to fine him $500 because his son's basketball hoop was visible from the street. Another woman, Mrs. Hensley, said they demanded she repaint her front door because it was too bold of a red. The more I listened, the more I realized the HOA's real weapon wasn't the fines or the letters, it was the fear. Fear of being singled out. Fear of losing your home over unpaid penalties. Fear of retaliation. That's why no one stood up for us when Greg hit Claire. Not one neighbor came forward to give a statement, even though I know at least 2 of them saw it happen from their windows. They weren't bad people. They were scared people. And fear is the soil where power grows best. I sat at my desk late one night, flipping through the HOA handbook, my notes spread across the table. The language was clean, almost sterile, but I saw the patterns, vague rules that could be interpreted however the board wanted, clauses that gave them authority to ensure community harmony, which basically meant they could do whatever they pleased as long as they claimed it was for the greater good. That's when it clicked. This wasn't about my truck. This wasn't even about my shed or last year's fines. This was about control. And the moment you resist control, the people in charge have two choices: let it go, or crush you. The Cedar Pines board had made their choice. The real question now wasn't what they were willing to do. I already had that answer, staring at me in the form of my wife's bruised face. The question was, how far was I willing to go to stop them? By the next HOA meeting, I knew I had to find the weak point in their armor. Every empire has one. But first, I had to watch them a little longer. Study them. Because if you want to take down a regime, even a small one run out of a neighborhood clubhouse, you don't start by knocking on their door. You start by finding out what they're most afraid of losing. And I had a feeling I was getting close. The morning after the next board meeting, the neighborhood went silent on me. Not just quiet, silent. Neighbors I'd waved to for years suddenly found something very interesting on the ground when I passed. Conversations on the sidewalk cut short when I got close. The sound of garage doors shutting at the exact moment I stepped outside became so common it felt like a signal. Claire tried to brush it off at first. "Maybe they just don't want to get involved," she said, sitting at the kitchen table with an ice pack pressed to her still tender cheek. But I could see it, the shift in her eyes, the way she started peeking through the blinds before stepping outside. That was the first cost: isolation. It wasn't just social. It was strategic. The Cedar Pines board knew that a united neighborhood was dangerous to their control. But a divided one? That was easy to manage. I found out later that Lisa had personally visited several houses in the following days. She told them I was unstable, that I'd threatened the board, that Greg had only defended himself. She made it sound like I was a ticking time bomb, the kind of neighbor you avoided at all costs. It worked. Carlos, my friend from 2 doors down, stopped letting his son come over to shoot hoops. Mrs. Hensley crossed the street when she saw Claire walking the dog. Even the Hendersons, who'd shared Thanksgiving with us the year before, wouldn't return my calls. I wasn't just fighting the HOA anymore. I was fighting the story they'd told about me. The second cost came a week later. I got a letter, official HOA stationery, claiming that my lawn was non-compliant because of uneven color distribution. It was the middle of January. The grass was dead everywhere. But that didn't matter. They fined me $200 and gave me 7 days to restore uniformity. When I didn't pay, the next letter threatened a lien on my property. Claire sat across from me at the kitchen table that night, her eyes wet with frustration. "They're going to make our lives hell," she whispered. "They're going to find every excuse, every technicality." I nodded. "That's the point," I said. The ripple effects didn't stop with us. I started noticing other families getting sudden visits from Greg. Older couples, single parents, anyone who might be too tired or too busy to fight back. One evening, I was walking the dog when I saw Greg in Mrs. Fowler's driveway. She's 72, lives alone, and had been part of the neighborhood since before the HOA even existed. Greg was pointing at her gutter, clipboard in hand, his voice just loud enough for me to catch the tone, sharp, condescending. When he noticed me, his expression tightened. "Just doing a routine inspection," he said. Mrs. Fowler didn't meet my eyes. That's when I realized something. This wasn't about keeping the neighborhood beautiful. This was about keeping people small. The third cost was tension, a kind that soaked into every streetlight and mailbox. Board meetings became battlegrounds. Residents whispered in the back rows, careful not to speak too loudly. Whenever someone tried to raise a concern, Lisa's smile would harden, and Greg would lean forward like a dog on a leash, ready to pounce. The air felt heavier. Doors slammed harder. Even the kids played quieter. It's hard to explain unless you've lived through it, how a simple HOA dispute can grow into a shadow hanging over everything. You wake up every day wondering if this will be the morning you get another letter. Another fine. Another accusation. You stop feeling like you live in a neighborhood. You start feeling like you live in occupied territory. One night, Claire asked me a question I couldn't answer. We were sitting on the porch, the cold night air biting through our coats. She stared at the street, where the lamplight glowed on the damp asphalt. "What if they never stop?" she asked. I didn't say anything right away. Because deep down, I knew she was right to ask. The Cedar Pines board didn't operate on fairness or reason. They operated on dominance. And people who rule that way don't just give it up because they lose one fight. The fourth cost came unexpectedly. I was at the grocery store when Officer Daniels, a local cop I'd known since my Army days, pulled me aside in the parking lot. He looked uncomfortable, like he didn't want to be having this conversation. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice. "Off the record, the HOA's been calling in noise complaints on you. Late-night construction, loud arguments, that kind of thing. We haven't found anything, but you might want to keep your head down for a while." I laughed bitterly. Keep my head down? That's exactly what they want. He sighed. "I'm just saying, they're trying to build a case." That night, I sat in my truck outside the house for almost an hour before going in. Not because I was afraid of them, but because I was afraid of what I might do if they pushed me any further. The HOA had already punched my wife. They'd turned my neighbors against me, threatened my home, and now they were trying to drag my name through the mud with law enforcement. What was next? I didn't know. But I knew one thing: I couldn't just wait for it to happen. By the end of that week, the decision was made. I was done playing defense. If they wanted to make me the villain, I'd show them what a real fight looked like. The first step was patience. In the Army, we learned that charging in head first is the fastest way to walk into an ambush. You don't rush the enemy, you study them, watch their patterns, find the moment they least expect to be hit. So, I started gathering evidence. Every letter, every fine, every false accusation, I kept them in a thick binder on my desk. I installed cameras around the property, high enough to avoid tampering. I even bought a small audio recorder I kept in my pocket whenever I left the house. If the board wanted a war, I was going to fight it with receipts. But evidence alone wasn't enough. I needed people. And that's when I started knocking on doors. At first, the conversations were awkward. Neighbors were cautious, speaking in half-sentences, glancing over their shoulders. But the more I listened, really listened, the more they began to open up. Carlos told me about the time Greg stood in his driveway, arms crossed, until Carlos agreed to move his truck from the curb. Mrs. Hensley admitted they'd fined her $300 for a garden gnome visible from the street. Even the Hendersons, who'd been avoiding me for weeks, confessed they'd been told they could lose community privileges if they kept associating with me. The stories piled up like kindling. All I needed was a spark. That spark came from Mrs. Fowler, the 72-year-old I'd seen Greg harassing over her gutter. One afternoon, she handed me a manila envelope. Inside were copies of emails from the board, dating back 3 years. They were internal messages, the kind they'd never meant for homeowners to see. And they were damning. Lisa instructing Marvin to find any reason to fine certain residents. Greg suggesting they increase pressure on people who resisted HOA orders. Even a thread where they openly discussed targeting me after I'd beaten them on the shed dispute. It was proof, not just of corruption, but of deliberate harassment. The next step was getting it out into the open. I knew the board controlled the official meeting agendas, but state law required an open forum for homeowners at the end of every meeting. That was my window. For 2 weeks, I prepared. I made copies of every incriminating email and matched them with letters, fines, and eyewitness statements. I put together a timeline showing exactly how the board had abused its authority. And then I did something they didn't expect. I invited people. Not just a handful, I went door to door, urging residents to come to the next meeting. I told them, if you've ever been wronged by this board, you need to be there. By the time the night came, the small clubhouse was packed wall to wall. Lisa opened the meeting with her usual syrupy smile, pretending nothing was different. Marvin droned through budget reports. Greg sat there, arms folded, glaring at me across the room. When the open forum began, I stood. And I didn't start with my own story. I started with Carlos's. Then Mrs. Hensley's. Then Mrs. Fowler's. One by one, I laid out each case, handing printed copies to the residents so they could see it for themselves. The murmurs started small, then grew louder as I read excerpts from the board's own emails. When I got to the thread about targeting me, someone in the back actually shouted, "That's illegal." Lisa tried to cut me off, claiming I was out of order. I reminded her, loudly, that the open forum was protected by state statute, and any attempt to silence a homeowner could result in legal action. Greg shifted in his seat. For the first time since this all began, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. By the end of the meeting, the board was cornered. They couldn't eject me without making it look worse. They couldn't deny the emails without calling Mrs. Fowler a liar. And then came the twist I'd been waiting for. I pulled out a final sheet of paper, a formal notice of intent to sue the HOA for harassment, defamation, and violation of homeowners' rights. It was signed, dated, and backed by an attorney friend of mine from my military days. The room went silent. "This stops now," I said, looking directly at Greg. "Or it gets a lot worse for all of you." The fallout was immediate. Half the room was buzzing, the other half staring at the board like they were seeing them for the first time. Several residents approached me afterward, offering to testify if it went to court. But the real victory wasn't just in the evidence or the lawsuit. It was in the shift. For the first time, people weren't avoiding me, they were standing beside me. I knew the board wouldn't go down without a fight. They'd double down, try new tricks, maybe even bring in lawyers of their own. But now, they weren't facing just me. They were facing an entire neighborhood that finally saw them for what they really were. And that was the first time I truly believed we could win. The weeks after that meeting felt like standing in the eye of a storm. There was a strange calm, no new fines, no letters, no Greg pounding on my door, but I could feel the tension swirling just beyond view. The board went quiet. Too quiet. I knew they were regrouping. People like Lisa don't just surrender because they get embarrassed in front of their neighbors. Then, 3 weeks later, the counterattack came. I got a certified letter, hand-delivered by a courier, stamped in bold red, "Cease and desist." It accused me of defamation, inciting hostility against the HOA, and, my personal favorite, creating an unsafe environment for board members. Claire read it over my shoulder and laughed, but there was no humor in it. "They're scared," she said. "You cornered them, and now they're lashing out." She was right. And fear makes people sloppy. 2 days later, I got an email from Carlos, subject line, "You need to see this." It was a forwarded message from Greg, sent by accident to the wrong recipient. In it, Greg admitted that the board's attorney had warned them the lawsuit could be extremely damaging if it went to court. He also mentioned making sure certain files disappear before discovery. That was it. The smoking gun. I didn't wait. I sent the email, along with copies of every piece of evidence I'd collected, to my lawyer. I also CC'd every homeowner in the neighborhood. By the end of the day, my phone was blowing up. Some messages were from residents thanking me. Others were from people I barely knew, asking how they could help. It wasn't just my fight anymore, it was our fight. The next HOA meeting was the largest in Cedar Pines history. Standing room only. People crowded the back, spilling out the door, murmuring in low, tense voices. Lisa tried to open the meeting like nothing was wrong, but she didn't even get through the agenda before someone shouted from the crowd. "When are you resigning?" Another voice joined in. And another. Greg's jaw was tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the table. Marvin stared at the papers in front of him like maybe if he didn't look up, he could disappear. Then Mrs. Fowler, the woman who had risked everything by giving me those emails, stood. She's barely 5 feet tall, but that night, she towered over the entire room. "You've abused your power," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "You've bullied this neighborhood for years. And we are done." The room erupted. People were on their feet, shouting for change, demanding a vote to remove the board. State law required that any board member could be removed with a majority vote at an open meeting. Lisa tried to gavel it down, but the sound was drowned by the voices around her. The vote happened right there. It wasn't even close. By the end of the night, Lisa, Greg, and Marvin were no longer on the board. Interim members were appointed, people the community trusted, people who had been on the receiving end of the same harassment. It was over. Or at least, that's what I thought. The first night after their removal, Claire and I sat on the porch, the warm air smelling faintly of rain. For the first time in months, I felt my shoulders unclench. No more cameras trained on our house from across the street. No more fines for non-uniform grass color. Just peace. But as I watched the quiet street, something settled in my chest, a realization that surprised me. This fight had started because Greg punched my wife. But the truth was, it had never really been about us. It was about a system that let people like him hold power without accountability. It wasn't the bylaws that were dangerous. It was the people interpreting them for their own gain. And I realized, if it happened here, it could happen anywhere. That's when I decided this wouldn't be the last HOA I dealt with. Not because I wanted to live in constant battle, but because I knew how easy it was for good people to be silenced when no one stands up. In the military, we were taught that freedom isn't just something you protect overseas. Sometimes, the fight for it happens right on your own street, in front of houses with white mailboxes and neat lawns. Claire squeezed my hand. "You did it," she said softly. I shook my head. "We did it. All of us." A month later, the new board dropped every fine, voided every false violation, and passed new bylaws that limited board power and required transparent records. Greg moved out of the neighborhood. Lisa put her house on the market. Marvin disappeared quietly, like a man hoping no one remembered his name. Cedar Pines wasn't perfect after that, no place ever is, but it was free. And sometimes, that's all you can ask for. When I look back now, I don't just remember the bruises on Claire's face or the letters on my porch. I remember the moment I realized fear only works if you let it. And I wonder, if someone else out there is living under the thumb of a petty little empire, what would happen if they decided to push back? Because if there's one thing I learned, it's this. The second you stand up, you're not just fighting for yourself, you're giving everyone else permission to stand, too.